In the quiet lakeside city of Pinewood Ridge, Michigan, public service was supposed to be a sacred duty, but behind the polished facades of City Hall and the police department, a web of corruption had been growing for years, until it culminated in the shocking murder of Mayor Robert "Bobby" Harrington on a cold January night in 2018. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When Mayor Harrington's body was discovered in his office with 3 bullets in his chest, the city was left reeling. But what would prove even more devastating was that the investigation would lead directly to the person charged with keeping Pinewood Ridge safe. Police Chief Vincent Dougherty, a decorated law enforcement veteran with nearly 3 decades of service. The murder would expose a network of kickbacks, shell companies, and manipulated contracts that had siphoned millions from the city's coffers. As one FBI investigator later remarked, this wasn't just a murder, it was the desperate final act in a play about power, greed, and the betrayal of public trust. This is the story of how a city's 2 most powerful figures descended into a deadly game of corruption, and how one of them decided that murder was preferable to exposure. Pinewood Ridge sits on the shores of Lake Michigan, about 70 miles north of Detroit. With a population hovering around 75,000, it's large enough to attract significant development, but small enough that most residents recognize their local officials on site. The city experienced a modest renaissance in the early 2000s after decades of post-industrial decline, with new waterfront developments and a revitalized downtown bringing in tourism dollars and new residents seeking respite from bigger cities. Robert "Bobby" Harrington grew up in Pinewood Ridge, the son of a factory worker and a school secretary. His path to politics began early: student council president in high school, then local activism while attending Michigan State University. After earning his law degree and spending several years at a Detroit firm, Harrington returned to his hometown, first winning a seat on the city council in 2007, and then launching a successful mayoral campaign in 2014. Positioning himself as a fresh voice who could accelerate Pinewood Ridge's economic revival. Charming and ambitious, Mayor Harrington, 42 at the time of his election, promised transparency and accountable government. "We're going to bring Pinewood Ridge into a new era," he declared in his inauguration speech. "An era where City Hall works for everyone, not just the connected few." Vincent Dougherty's story had a different trajectory. He wasn't born in Pinewood Ridge but arrived as a rookie police officer in 1989 after serving 4 years in the Army. Rising steadily through the ranks, Dougherty built a reputation as a tough but fair cop who could navigate both the streets and the politics of law enforcement. By 2010, he had ascended to police chief, overseeing a department of 120 officers. Chief Dougherty, 53 at the time of Harrington's election, presented himself as an old-school law and order type. Square-jawed and imposing at 6'2", with salt and pepper, hair kept in a military-style cut, he cultivated relationships with business leaders and earned respect from the community through various outreach programs. His wife, Lynn, was active in local charity work, and their 2 adult children had both entered public service, one as a prosecutor, the other as a military officer. When Harrington became mayor, the relationship between the 2 men seemed cordial, if somewhat reserved. The young mayor respected Dougherty's experience, while the chief appeared to appreciate Harrington's energy and commitment to the city. At public events, they presented a united front, often photographed shaking hands or in deep conversation. They were like the new guard and the old guard coming together, recalled Sarah Matthews, who served as Harrington's chief of staff. Different generations, different approaches, but both seemed genuinely committed to the city. What wasn't visible in those public handshakes was the infrastructure of corruption that Chief Doherty had quietly built over the previous decade, a system that would soon clash with Mayor Harrington's plans. The trouble began with Pinewood, Ridge's infrastructure boom. After winning a competitive grant from the state for $30 million in 2015, Mayor Harrington launched an ambitious plan to upgrade the city's roads, bridges, and public spaces. The centerpiece was a waterfront redevelopment project intended to transform an old industrial zone into a mixed-use area with parks, condominiums, and retail spaces. These projects required numerous contracts for everything from architectural plans to construction materials. Under city protocol, contracts exceeding $250,000 required competitive bidding and approval from both the mayor's office and the city council. Contracts below that threshold followed a more streamlined process that gave department heads significant discretion. It was in this grey area that Chief Doherty had cultivated his scheme, one that had begun years before Harrington took office. Through a network of friends, family members, and associates, Doherty had connections to several local businesses that regularly secured city contracts. Central to this network was Mountain Creek Holdings, a construction materials company officially owned by Michael Renner, Doherty's former partner from his patrol days, who had retired early due to a back injury. In reality, Doherty held a silent 40% ownership stake in the company, funneled through a series of LLCs registered in his brother-in-law's name. Mountain Creek wasn't big enough to handle the major projects, explained Detective Marcus Jenkins, who would later work on the case. But they were perfectly positioned to get the subcontracts and supply contracts that flew under the radar. For years, the system had operated without scrutiny. Police department renovations would mysteriously require materials that only Mountain Creek could provide at short notice. City vehicles would need specialized parts that came through another company connected to Doherty's network. Security upgrades would be installed by firms that kicked back percentages to shell companies controlled by the chief's associates. The scheme extended beyond the police department. Doherty had cultivated relationships with other department heads, offering favors, applying pressure, or sharing the spoils to ensure that his connected companies received preferential treatment across city operations. By the time Harrington became mayor, this system was generating approximately $400,000 annually in illicit profits for Doherty and his partners, all siphoned from taxpayer funds through inflated contracts, unnecessary work, and manipulated bidding processes. For the first 18 months of Harrington's term, this arrangement continued undisturbed. The new mayor was focused on his showcase projects and building political capital. Department-level contracting simply wasn't on his radar. That changed in the summer of 2016, when Harrington hired Elaine Winters as the city's new finance director. A seasoned municipal accountant with a background in forensic auditing, Winters began implementing stricter oversight procedures across all departments. Elaine was a game changer, Matthews later testified. She didn't care about politics or making friends. She just wanted the books to be clean. Winters quickly identified patterns in city contracts that raised red flags, particularly around the police department's expenditures. Materials purchased at 30% above market rate. Renovations that seemed to occur with unusual frequency. Consulting fees for vaguely defined services. In September 2016, she compiled her findings and presented them to Mayor Harrington. While she didn't directly accuse anyone of wrongdoing, the implications were clear. Something was amiss in how certain departments were spending public money. Harrington was disturbed but cautious. Doherty was a powerful figure in the city with strong connections to the business community and unwavering support from his department. Accusing him without ironclad Evidence would be politically dangerous. The mayor decided on a measured approach. He scheduled a private meeting with Chief Doherty in October 2016, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming annual budget. During that meeting, Harrington raised concerns about inefficiencies in departmental contracting and announced his intention to implement new oversight procedures. According to Matthews, who was briefed immediately after the meeting, the chief took it calmly, even expressed support for greater transparency. But Bobby said there was something off in his reaction, like he was wearing a mask that slipped for just a second. That meeting marked the beginning of a shadow war between the two most powerful men in Pinewood Ridge. Over the next few months, Doherty took steps to cover his tracks. Contracts were rerouted through different companies. Documentation was altered or lost during digital system upgrades. Meanwhile, he began quietly working to undermine Harrington politically, meeting with council members who opposed the mayor's agenda and feeding negative information about Harrington to local reporters. The mayor, sensing the resistance but not fully understanding its scope, pressed forward with new financial controls. In February 2017, he implemented a policy requiring all department contracts, regardless of size, to be reviewed by Winter's office before approval. The new policy immediately impacted Doherty's operation. Several contracts connected to his network were flagged and delayed. In 2 cases, Winter's office recommended cheaper alternatives, costing Mountain Creek Holdings significant expected revenue. By spring 2017, the relationship between Harrington and Doherty had deteriorated behind closed doors, though they maintained cordial appearances in public. City employees noted the tension during meetings where both were present. You could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees when they were in the same room, recalled Linda Patel, who worked in the city's communications office. They were professional, but there was clearly something brewing beneath the surface. The conflict escalated in June 2017 when Winters discovered a particularly suspicious pattern involving Bayshore Security Systems, a company that had installed new surveillance equipment in city buildings over the previous 3 years at costs significantly above competing bids. Her research revealed that Bayshore was registered to Jason Turner, the brother-in-law of Peter Maxwell, who served as Doherty's administrative lieutenant. When confronted with this information, Harrington decided to dig deeper. He quietly authorized Winters to conduct a comprehensive review of all city contracts over the previous 5 years, with special attention to vendors connected to city employees. Unbeknownst to the mayor, a clerk in the finance department who was dating an officer loyal to Doherty informed the chief about the investigation. Doherty now realized that his entire operation was at risk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His first response was to attempt damage control. He scheduled his own private meeting with Harrington in July 2017, suggesting they discuss mutual concerns about city operations. According to Matthews, who again was briefed afterward, Doherty came with a dual approach. First, he hinted that investigating the police department's operations too aggressively could damage morale and public safety. Then, he subtly suggested that he had concerns about some of the mayor's campaign donors who had received contracts for the waterfront development project. It was basically a veiled threat, Matthews later testified. He was telling Bobby that if he went after the police department, he'd find ways to make the mayor look corrupt too. Harrington refused to back down. "I was elected to clean up this city," he reportedly told Doherty, "and that's exactly what I'm going to do." The meeting ended with both men understanding that a line had been crossed. The pretense of cooperation was over. Through the fall of 2017, the conflict intensified. Winters continued her investigation, gradually assembling evidence of the contract manipulation. Dougherty stepped up his behind-the-scenes campaign against the mayor, using his connections to create political obstacles and plant negative stories. In November 2017, the mayor's office suffered a suspicious break-in. Nothing of value was taken, but files related to the contract review were disturbed. The police department investigated, but found insufficient evidence to identify any suspects. By December, Winters had compiled enough evidence to justify bringing in outside investigators. Mayor Harrington contacted the State Attorney General's office to discuss the situation confidentially. A preliminary meeting was scheduled for January 25, 2018. Dougherty learned of this meeting through a contact in the Attorney General's office. He now knew he had weeks, not months, before his scheme would be exposed. On January 15th, 10 days before the scheduled meeting, Chief Vincent Dougherty made a final attempt to resolve the situation. He requested another private meeting with Mayor Harrington, this time after hours at City Hall. Security camera footage shows Dougherty arriving at 7:45 p.m. and being directed to the mayor's office by the evening security guard, Thomas Wilson. What happened in that office would only be reconstructed later through forensic evidence. But at 8:32 p.m., Wilson heard what he thought might be doors slamming from the direction of the mayor's office. When he went to investigate, he found the mayor's door locked. After knocking and receiving no response, he used his master key to enter. Inside, he found Mayor Robert Harrington slumped over his desk, blood pooling on the polished wood surface and important documents scattered across the floor. 3 bullet wounds punctured his chest. There was no sign of Chief Dougherty. The security guard immediately called 911. The first officers to respond were from Dougherty's own police department. Among them was Detective Sophia Reynolds, who would later play a crucial role in bringing her boss to justice. That January night marked the end of Robert Harrington's life and vision for Pinewood Ridge. But it also began the unraveling of a corruption scheme that had bled the city dry for years, and the downfall of the man who had built it, the same man who believed murder was the only way to protect it. The murder of Mayor Robert Harrington sent shockwaves through Pinewood Ridge. By morning, news crews from Detroit had descended on the lakeside community, their satellite trucks, lining the streets around City Hall, which was now wrapped in yellow crime scene tape. Detective Sophia Reynolds arrived at the scene within minutes of the 911 call. At 38, Reynolds had spent 12 years with the Pinewood Ridge Police Department, earning a reputation as methodical and incorruptible. She had been promoted to detective 4 years earlier by Chief Dougherty himself, a fact that would later take on grim irony. "Something felt wrong from the moment I walked in," Reynolds later testified. "Not just the obvious, a murdered mayor, but the way the scene looked. Too neat in some ways, too messy in others." The mayor's office showed signs of what appeared to be a confrontation. A chair was overturned and papers were scattered across the floor. But Reynolds' trained eye noted inconsistencies. The disorder seemed concentrated in one area, almost staged, while other parts of the room remained undisturbed. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. Most tellingly, there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had killed Harrington had been admitted willingly into his office. The investigation's first critical break came from Thomas Wilson, the evening security guard who had discovered the body. During his interview, Wilson mentioned that Chief Dougherty had visited the mayor shortly before the estimated time of death. "The chief came in around 7:45, Wilson stated, said he had an urgent meeting with the mayor. I called up to confirm, and Mayor Harrington said to send him right up. When detectives attempted to locate Dougherty for questioning, they discovered he had called in sick that morning, the first time he had used a sick day in over 3 years. Calls to his cell phone went straight to voicemail. By protocol, the investigation should have been led by the department's most senior detective, Marcus Webb. But Webb abruptly recused himself, citing his close personal relationship with Chief Doherty. The responsibility fell to Reynolds, who quickly assembled a team and established a command center separate from the main police building. "I knew we needed distance from the department," Reynolds explained later, "if the chief was involved, and at that point it was just a question mark. We needed to insulate the investigation from any influence." Reynolds' first decision was to contact the Michigan State Police for assistance, a move that raised eyebrows among some officers loyal to Doherty. By noon, state investigators were on the scene, including forensic specialists who began a painstaking examination of the mayor's office. At 2:17 p.m., nearly 18 hours after the murder, Vincent Doherty finally resurfaced, arriving at the police department in civilian clothes. He expressed shock at the news and immediately offered the department's full resources to find the killer. When informed that Reynolds had already requested state assistance, witnesses described a momentary flash of anger crossing his face before he regained composure. "Of course," he reportedly said. "We want all hands on deck for this. Robert deserves justice." Doherty agreed to an interview, but insisted it be conducted by Webb rather than Reynolds. This request was denied. In the subsequent 2-hour conversation with Reynolds and a state police investigator, Doherty confirmed his meeting with the mayor, but claimed he had left shortly after 8 p.m. with Harrington very much alive. "We discussed departmental budgets," Doherty stated. "It was routine, a bit tense maybe because budgets always are, but nothing unusual happened." When asked about his whereabouts after the meeting, Doherty claimed he had driven directly home, arriving around 8:30 p.m. His wife Lynn had already been asleep, he said, so there was no one to confirm his arrival time. "I had a couple of drinks and went to bed," he concluded. "Next morning I woke up with a stomach bug." The interview concluded with Doherty voluntarily providing his fingerprints and DNA samples. He was not placed under arrest. The evidence was still too circumstantial, but Reynolds made sure he understood he was not to leave town. As Doherty exited the interview room, Reynolds made a crucial decision. Rather than focusing solely on the murder, she would pursue 2 parallel investigations: the homicide itself and the corruption allegations that Winters had been assembling. The two, she suspected, were inextricably linked. Meanwhile, City Hall operations had ground to a halt. By municipal charter, the City Council President, Walter Mitchell, was elevated to acting mayor. Mitchell, a 62-year-old former banker, had served on the council for over a decade and was known to be politically aligned with Doherty. One of Mitchell's first actions was to request that Finance Director Elaine Winters temporarily pause any ongoing financial reviews out of respect for the mayor. When Winters refused, citing her professional obligations, Mitchell attempted to place her on administrative leave. This move was blocked by the city attorney, who warned it could be seen as obstruction of justice if it interfered with a potential criminal investigation. The power struggle at City Hall became public when Winters gave an interview to the Pinewood Ridge Chronicle, carefully avoiding specific accusations, but making it clear that Harrington had been investigating financial irregularities before his death. Mayor Harrington believed in transparency and accountability, she told the newspaper. The best way to honor his memory is to continue that work. The article caught Reynolds' attention. Within hours, she had obtained a warrant to access all of Winters' files related to the contract review. What she found transformed the case. Winters had compiled evidence showing over $2.4 million in questionable contracts over the previous 5 years. The documentation revealed a pattern of city projects being awarded to a small circle of companies, many with connections to police department personnel. At the center was Mountain Creek Holdings, which had received over $800,000 in contracts, despite consistently higher prices than competitors. Further investigation by Reynolds' team uncovered the web of shell companies and hidden ownership that connected these businesses to Dougherty and his associates. Bank records showed suspicious transfers between these companies and accounts controlled by Michael Renner, Dougherty's former partner, and the nominal owner of Mountain Creek Holdings. When confronted with this evidence, Renner initially denied any wrongdoing, but faced with potential charges of his own, he eventually admitted to the scheme and Dougherty's involvement. "Vince set it all up," Renner confessed during a recorded interview. "He'd tell me which contracts to bid on, how much to charge. I'd run the business day to day, but he called the shots. We split the profits after paying off the others in the network." Renner also revealed that Dougherty had been increasingly concerned about Mayor Harrington's scrutiny. "He was raging about it," Renner stated, "said the mayor was going to ruin everything we'd built. About a week before the murder, Vince told me we might need to shut down operations for a while. He seemed different, colder, more calculated. With Renner's testimony and the financial evidence, Reynolds now had a clear motive. But physical evidence connecting Dougherty directly to the murder remained elusive until a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carol Jenkins, a janitor who worked nights at City Hall, came forward 5 days after the murder. Initially, too frightened to speak, she revealed that she had been cleaning the floor below the mayor's office on the night of the murder and had seen Chief Dougherty leaving the building around 8:45 p.m., nearly 45 minutes after he claimed to have departed. He was wearing gloves, Jenkins recalled. It was unusual because it wasn't that cold that night, and he was carrying a small bag that he hadn't had when he came in. I said hello, but he just walked past me like he didn't hear. This testimony contradicted Dougherty's alibi and placed him at the scene well into the time frame when the medical examiner determined Harrington had been killed. Further analysis of security camera footage from neighboring buildings confirmed that Dougherty's car had remained in the City Hall parking lot until 8:47 p.m. Reynolds' team also made a critical discovery when analyzing Dougherty's cell phone records. Though he had been careful to leave his phone at home on the night of the murder, the data showed repeated searches in the preceding days for information on undetectable poisons, making a murder look like robbery, and gunshot residue removal. 9 days after the murder, with evidence mounting, Reynolds obtained a warrant to search Dougherty's home and vehicles. In the garage of his lakeside residence, forensic technicians discovered minuscule blood spatter on a pair of shoes tucked in a storage box. DNA analysis confirmed it was Harrington's blood. Most damning of all, a dive team searching the lake behind Dougherty's property recovered a pistol from the water approximately 50 yards from his dock. Ballistics tests confirmed it was the murder weapon, and it was registered to Dougherty as a backup service weapon. On January 28, 2018, 13 days after Mayor Harrington's murder, Detective Sophia Reynolds arrested Police Chief Vincent Dougherty at his home. The image of the police chief being led away in handcuffs, broadcast live on local television, would become one of the most infamous moments in Pinewood Ridge history. Dougherty maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed by political enemies. His attorney, Stanley Kramer, held a press conference asserting that the case was circumstantial and motivated by departmental politics. Chief Dougherty has served this community with distinction for nearly 30 years, Kramer told reporters. The rush to judgment here is unconscionable. We will fight these charges vigorously and prove his innocence. But the evidence continued to accumulate. In the weeks following the arrest, Reynolds and state investigators unraveled the full extent of Dougherty's corruption network. 6 other city employees were implicated, including 2 police officers and a senior member of the Public Works Department. The corruption investigation also revealed that acting Mayor Mitchell had received benefits from Dougherty's network, including renovations to his vacation home paid for by one of the shell companies. Mitchell resigned in disgrace, and the city council appointed Sarah Matthews, Harrington's former chief of staff, as interim mayor until a special election could be held. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced a difficult decision. Michael Renner, Peter Maxwell, and the other members of the corruption ring were offering testimony against Dougherty in exchange for leniency. But District Attorney William Abernathy was determined that the man who murdered an elected official should receive no such deal. "We had multiple paths to conviction," Abernathy later explained. "The corruption charges alone carried potential sentences of up to 20 years. But nothing less than a first-degree murder conviction would truly represent justice for Mayor Harrington and the people of Pinewood Ridge." The trial began in September 2018, drawing national media attention. The prosecution presented a meticulous case, walking jurors through both the corruption scheme and the calculated murder that sought to conceal it. Elaine Winters testified about discovering the contract irregularities and Harrington's determination to investigate them fully. "He told me, even if this leads to powerful people, we have to follow it through. That's what I promised the voters." Reynolds provided the most damaging testimony, detailing how Dougherty had abused his position to both profit from the city and then eliminate the one person who threatened to expose him. "This wasn't a crime of passion," she told the court. "Chief Dougherty methodically planned Mayor Harrington's murder when he realized his criminal enterprise was about to be exposed. He used his intimate knowledge of police procedures to attempt to cover his tracks. He betrayed not just his oath as a police officer, but the fundamental trust this community placed in him." Dougherty's defense team attempted to portray their client as the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by ambitious subordinates like Reynolds and political rivals who wanted to seize control of lucrative city contracts. They suggested that Renner had committed the murder and then framed Dougherty to protect himself. But the physical evidence and testimony from multiple witnesses proved overwhelming. After 7 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, racketeering, corruption, and obstruction of justice. On December 7, 2018, Judge Patricia Coleman sentenced Vincent Dougherty to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Mayor Robert Harrington, plus an additional 30 years for the corruption charges. As he was led from the courtroom, Dougherty remained stoic, showing no remorse. His final words in court were directed not at the family of his victim, but at Detective Reynolds. "You'll never understand what it takes to protect a city." Reynolds, who had since been promoted to lead the department's new anti-corruption unit, reportedly responded simply, "That's exactly what Mayor Harrington was trying to do." The conviction of Vincent Dougherty marked a turning point for Pinewood Ridge. The city instituted sweeping reforms to contract procedures and established an independent ethics commission with broad investigatory powers. The police department underwent a top-to-bottom restructuring under new leadership. In a special ceremony in 2019, the newly completed waterfront park, the project Robert Harrington had championed, was named in his honor. A plaque bears his, quote, "Public service is a sacred trust, not a path to personal gain." The case has since become a standard study in police academies across the country, a stark reminder of how power, when unchecked, can corrupt even those sworn to uphold the law, and how the courage of individuals like Harrington, Winters, and Reynolds can ultimately bring justice, even at tremendous cost. While Vincent Doherty began serving his life sentence at Northern Michigan Correctional Facility in February 2019, the reverberations of his crimes continued to echo through Pinewood Ridge. The case that many assumed had concluded with Doherty's conviction would reveal deeper layers of corruption and unexpected connections in the years that followed. Sophia Reynolds, now promoted to captain and heading the department's newly formed Integrity Division, wasn't satisfied that justice had been fully served. "We got the killer and his immediate accomplices," she confided to colleagues, "but I can't shake the feeling that we're only seeing the surface of something bigger." Her instincts proved correct. In March 2019, 3 months after Doherty's sentencing, an anonymous package arrived at the Pinewood Ridge Police Department, addressed to Reynolds. Inside was a thumb drive containing thousands of files, emails, financial records, and photographs that appeared to have been meticulously collected over several years. The sender identified themselves only as Watchman and included a brief, typed note: "Doherty didn't act alone. Follow the money beyond the city limits." Initial analysis of the files revealed a stunning discovery. Mountain Creek Holdings and the other companies in Doherty's network hadn't just been securing contracts. In Pinewood Ridge, similar patterns appeared in 5 neighboring communities across Michigan's lakefront region. The corruption network extended far beyond what the investigation had uncovered. Most disturbing were emails between Doherty and several prominent regional business leaders, politicians, and even a circuit court judge, discussing what they euphemistically called regional development cooperation. The conversations carefully avoided explicit mentions of illegal activity, but contained unmistakable references to contract manipulation and profit sharing. "We're looking at something like a regional syndicate," Reynolds explained in a confidential briefing to District Attorney Abernathy. Doherty wasn't just running his own operation. He was part of a coordinated effort to control public contracts across multiple jurisdictions. Abernathy, who had built his reputation on the successful prosecution of Doherty, faced a difficult decision. The evidence suggested corruption reaching into the highest levels of regional power, including some of his own political allies. "This goes beyond Pinewood Ridge's jurisdiction," he told Reynolds. "We need state and federal resources." In April 2019, Reynolds and Abernathy jointly contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the Michigan Attorney General's office. Within weeks, a multi-agency task force was established under the codename Operation Lakewatch. Meanwhile, Pinewood Ridge was moving forward under new leadership. Sarah Matthews, who had served as interim mayor following Mitchell's resignation, won the special election in May 2019 with a platform promising transparency and ethical governance. One of her first actions was to appoint Elaine Winters as deputy mayor, giving the former finance director broad authority to implement systemic reforms. "We're not just replacing individuals," Matthews announced during her inauguration speech. "We're rebuilding institutions and creating safeguards to ensure nothing like this can happen again." The municipal reforms were comprehensive. Competitive bidding requirements for all contracts over $50,000, publicly accessible databases tracking all city expenditures, an independent ethics commission with investigative powers, and mandatory financial disclosure requirements for all department heads and elected officials. Behind the scenes, however, Operation Lakewatch was uncovering a network far more extensive than anyone had imagined. By August 2019, the investigation had identified what agents called the Lake Michigan Circle, a coalition of corrupt officials, business owners, and facilitators operating across 7 counties. At the center of this wider conspiracy was not Doherty, but Franklin Westbrook, a real estate developer and political fundraiser whose connections reached into the governor's office. Westbrook had established the framework for the corruption network as early as 2005, recruiting officials like Dougherty to create localized operations that fed into the larger enterprise. Dougherty was essentially a regional manager, explained FBI Special Agent Laura Diaz, who led the federal component of Operation Lakewatch. Important, but ultimately replaceable in Westbrook's organization. The investigation also revealed that Mayor Harrington's murder had sent shockwaves through the Lake Michigan circle. In the weeks following the killing, several members had severed ties with Dougherty's associates and destroyed evidence of their connections. Dougherty broke the cardinal rule, one unnamed cooperating witness told investigators. The system worked because it stayed invisible. Violence attracts attention, and attention kills the business. By early 2020, Operation Lakewatch had identified 37 individuals involved in the corruption network, including 3 mayors from neighboring communities, a county commissioner, 2 judges, 14 business owners, 5 police officials in addition to Dougherty, 12 other public employees in positions to influence contracts. The investigation also tracked over $37 million in fraudulent or manipulated contracts across the region over a 15-year period. In prison, Vincent Dougherty had maintained his silence, refusing interviews and declining to cooperate with ongoing investigations. But in June 2020, following reports about Operation Lakewatch appearing in regional media, he suddenly requested a meeting with prosecutors. "I've been watching what's happening," he told them. "You're getting close to the truth, but you don't have the full picture. I'm ready to fill in some blanks." In exchange for certain considerations, including transfer to a medium security facility and protection for his family, Dougherty provided detailed testimony about the Lake Michigan Circle and his role within it. His revelations accelerated the investigation and provided crucial evidence against several high-level figures who had previously appeared untouchable. Perhaps most significantly, Dougherty revealed that Mayor Harrington's murder hadn't been his idea alone. According to his testimony, after informing Westbrook about the mayor's investigation, he had received a call from a burner phone. The voice said, "This problem needs to disappear," Dougherty claimed. The meaning was clear, but the phrasing gave them deniability. That's how they operated. Nothing explicit, everything understood. Dougherty insisted he hadn't been ordered to kill Harrington, merely to resolve the problem. But he believed his standing in the organization depended on handling the situation decisively. The murder was his solution, one that ultimately proved catastrophic for the network. This revelation added a new dimension to the case, raising the possibility that others might share culpability for Harrington's death. However, lacking direct evidence beyond Dougherty's testimony, prosecutors could not bring murder-related charges against other members of the network. Instead, the task force focused on building racketeering and corruption cases against the organizational leadership. The investigation culminated in coordinated pre-dawn raids across Michigan on September 15, 2020, resulting in 28 arrests, including Franklin Westbrook. The raids made national headlines, with news outlets dubbing the case the Great Lakes Conspiracy. Michigan's governor ordered a state commission to review all major public contracts awarded during the previous decade. Neighboring states launched their own investigations into possible extensions of the network across state lines. For Pinewood Ridge, the arrests brought a mixture of vindication and disillusionment. The community had already begun its healing, in process following Dougherty's conviction, but the revelation that their tragedy was just one component of a vast criminal enterprise reopened wounds. People felt violated all over again. Sarah Matthews, now in her second year as mayor, later reflected, "We'd thought it was just a few bad apples in our city. Learning that we were targeted as part of a regional strategy, that our suffering was essentially a business decision for these people, that was hard to process. The broader case moved through the federal court system over the next 18 months. In a series of trials and plea agreements, 32 defendants were ultimately convicted on various charges including racketeering, bribery, money laundering, and tax evasion. Franklin Westbrook received a 25-year sentence after being convicted on 27 criminal counts. As the legal proceedings played out, Detective Reynolds, now Chief Reynolds following her appointment to lead the reformed Pinewood Ridge Police Department, continued to pursue one lingering question. Who was Watchman, the anonymous source whose information had blown the case wide open? The thumb drive that had arrived at her office contained information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the network's operations. Technical analysis of the files suggested they had been collected over at least 7 years, predating even the earliest suspicions about Doherty. Reynolds' breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a routine review of Mayor Harrington's personal effects that had been held as evidence, she discovered a small notebook with encrypted entries that hadn't previously been decoded. Working with a cryptography expert from the FBI, Reynolds determined that Harrington had been maintaining detailed records of suspicious patterns he had observed since his time on the city council. More surprising was a reference to Project Watchman, in entries dating back to 2015, nearly a year before he hired Elaine Winters to examine the city's finances. This suggested that Harrington's investigation had begun much earlier than anyone realized and had operated on multiple tracks. Further examination of Harrington's personal emails and financial records revealed communications with an investigative journalist named Marcus Sullivan, who had written several articles about public corruption for the Detroit Free Press. Sullivan had died unexpectedly of a heart attack in February 2018, just weeks after Harrington's murder. The timing raised questions, but a medical review confirmed Sullivan's death had been from natural causes. However, Reynolds discovered that Sullivan had been working on a major investigative piece about regional development corruption, work that was never published following his death. Harrington and Sullivan were building a case together, Reynolds concluded, not just against Dougherty, but against the entire network. They were watchmen, or at least part of it. This theory was supported when digital forensic experts determined that the files on the anonymous thumb drive included material that could only have come from Sullivan's work, combined with documents likely sourced from Harrington's office. But who had sent the drive months after both men had died? The final piece fell into place during a seemingly routine interview with Linda Patel, the former communications specialist from Harrington's administration. When gently pressed about her knowledge of Project Watchman, Patel initially denied any familiarity, but faced with the accumulating evidence, she eventually admitted her involvement. "Bobby trusted me," she explained, using the late mayor's nickname. "He knew the risks they were taking, so he created a failsafe. If anything happened to him, I was supposed to wait a specific period, then release everything they'd gathered." To whoever was leading the investigation, Patel revealed that Harrington had given her an encrypted hard drive with instructions to access it only if he died under suspicious circumstances. Following his murder, she had waited as instructed, then anonymously forwarded the information to Reynolds once it became clear the detective was pursuing the case honestly. "He believed in this city," Patel said tearfully. "He knew what might happen to him, but he kept going anyway. I couldn't let that sacrifice be for nothing." This revelation completed the circle, providing the final context for the tragedy that had unfolded in Pinewood Ridge. Robert Harrington hadn't stumbled blindly into danger. He had recognized the corruption early in his political career and had worked methodically to expose it, fully aware of the potential consequences. In recognition of this courage, the Michigan legislature posthumously awarded Harrington the state's highest civilian honor in October 2022. The ceremony, attended by his family and many Pinewood Ridge residents, included the unveiling of plans for a statewide public integrity initiative bearing his name. The Harrington Initiative established standardized transparency requirements for municipal contracts across Michigan and created an independent watchdog agency with authority to investigate corruption allegations in any jurisdiction in the state. "This is how we truly honor Bobby's memory," Sarah Matthews said during the ceremony, "not just by remembering what he stood for, but by building systems that make corruption harder and accountability inevitable." For Pinewood Ridge, the years following the Great Lakes conspiracy cases brought a period of renewal. Under Matthews' leadership, the city implemented reforms that became a model for other communities. The waterfront development that Harrington had envisioned was completed in 2023, bringing new economic life to the once struggling city. The police department, led by Sophia Reynolds until her retirement in 2024, rebuilt its reputation through community engagement and transparent operations. The integrity division she established became a permanent fixture, with officers specially trained to recognize and investigate potential corruption. Vincent Doherty, meanwhile, continues serving his life sentence. His cooperation with federal prosecutors earned him the transfer he requested, but also the enmity of his former associates. He lives in protective custody, isolated from other inmates who might seek retribution for his testimony. In his only public statement since his conviction, released through his attorney in 2023, Dougherty offered what some saw as a partial acknowledgement of responsibility. "I made choices that destroyed lives, including my own. Power and greed create their own kind of blindness. By the time I realized how far I had strayed from who I once was, it seemed too late to turn back." Elaine Winters, who served as deputy mayor until 2022 and now heads a national organization promoting municipal transparency, perhaps best summarized the lessons of the Pinewood Ridge tragedy. Corruption isn't just about money. It's about the betrayal of trust. When we allow public institutions to become vehicles for private gain, we undermine the very foundations of our communities. What happened here should serve as both a warning and an inspiration. The system failed, but individuals stood up, often at great personal risk, to set it right again. Today, visitors to Harrington Memorial Park can see a simple granite bench overlooking the lake. Inscribed on it are words from the mayor's inaugural address. "The measure of leadership is not what we take, but what we leave behind." For Pinewood Ridge and communities across Michigan, what Robert Harrington left behind was a legacy of courage and a roadmap for building governance worthy of public trust, purchased at the ultimate price, but changing the landscape of power forever. 5 years after Vincent Dougherty's conviction, when many assumed the story of Pinewood Ridge had reached its conclusion, a series of unexpected developments would cast the case in an entirely new light and reveal that some of the most influential players had remained hidden all along. The first tremor came in April 2023, when Franklin Westbrook, now 4 years into his 25-year federal sentence, was found dead in his cell at the medium-security Federal Correctional Institution in Milan, Michigan. Initial reports indicated an apparent suicide, but the circumstances immediately raised questions. Westbrook had shown no previous signs of suicidal ideation, according to prison staff. He had maintained an active correspondence with family members, and was pursuing several appeal strategies with his legal team. Most notably, he had scheduled a meeting with federal prosecutors for the following week, supposedly to provide new information in exchange for consideration of a reduced sentence. Shibor. Autopsy revealed that Westbrook had died from asphyxiation, consistent with the hanging reported by prison authorities. However, toxicology results showed the presence of a sedative not prescribed to him, suggesting he may have been unconscious when the hanging was staged. This wasn't suicide, insisted Special Agent Laura Diaz, who had been instrumental in bringing down the Lake Michigan Circle. Someone didn't want Westbrook to make that meeting with prosecutors. The FBI launched an investigation into the death, focusing on both prison staff and inmates who might have had contact with Westbrook in the days leading to his death. Security footage revealed nothing conclusive. Westbrook had been alone in his cell during the estimated time of death, and no unauthorized visitors had been recorded. The mystery deepened when Westbrook's attorney, Claudia Morrison, came forward with information about what her client had planned to reveal. According to Morrison, Westbrook had claimed to possess knowledge about connections between the Lake Michigan Circle and several nationally prominent business figures, individuals whose names had never surfaced during the original investigation. Franklin told me he had been the fall guy, Morrison stated in an affidavit. He said the real architects of the scheme had remained completely insulated, and that he finally had documentation that could prove their involvement. That documentation, if it existed, was never found. A search of Westbrook's cell, personal effects, and all known storage locations yielded nothing corresponding to Morrison's description. If such evidence had existed, it had been meticulously removed. The investigation into Westbrook's death hit a wall, eventually being classified as suspicious but inconclusive. But the questions he had raised before his death prompted federal authorities to quietly reopen certain aspects of the Lake Michigan Circle investigation. Meanwhile, in Pinewood Ridge, life had largely returned to normal. The city, now 6 years removed from Mayor Harrington's murder, had rebuilt its reputation under the leadership of Mayor Samantha Keller, who had succeeded Sarah Matthews after the latter accepted a position with the State Attorney General's office in 2022. The physical reminders of the tragedy remained: Harrington Memorial Park, the ethics training center named for Detective Reynolds after her retirement. But for many residents, especially newer arrivals, the corruption scandal had become history rather than lived experience. That changed in September 2023, when the Pinewood Ridge Chronicle published a 5-part investigative series titled The Invisible Hand. The author, investigative journalist Amelia Washington, had spent 3 years piecing together financial records, anonymous testimonies, and digital communications to present a shocking thesis. The Lake Michigan Circle had not been dismantled at all, merely reorganized. Washington's reporting suggested that while the most visible operators had been prosecuted, the fundamental structure had adapted and continued to function under new management. More disturbingly, she presented evidence indicating that the corruption network had never been a regional operation at all, but rather a local manifestation of a national system designed to capture and control public contracts in strategically selected communities across multiple states. What we uncovered in Michigan was just one tendril of a much larger organism, Washington wrote. The same patterns of contract manipulation, the same shell company structures, the same methods of recruiting and controlling public officials exist in at least 17 states, suggesting coordination at a level far beyond what prosecutors have acknowledged. The series caused an immediate sensation, prompting calls for congressional hearings and new federal investigations. But what transformed the story from explosive reporting to potential breakthrough was Washington's final revelation. She had received a data dump from an anonymous source containing over 300,000 documents detailing the national network's operations. Washington had shared this data with a consortium of journalists and federal authorities who were in the process of verifying and analyzing the information. Early findings pointed to a sophisticated operation centered around a private equity firm called Meridian Capital Partners, which specialized in investing in companies that secured government contracts. On the surface, Meridian appeared to be a legitimate investment company with impressive returns for its wealthy clients. Deeper examination, however, revealed that its consistent success stemmed not from market acumen, but from its ability to manipulate the contract process in communities. Where it had established influence, the Justice Department quickly empaneled a grand jury to investigate these allegations. Within weeks, federal agents had executed search warrants at Meridian's offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. The company's CEO, Edward Halsey, a respected figure in financial circles who had served in advisory roles for 2 presidential administrations, vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Meridian Capital Partners operates with the highest ethical standards, Halsey stated through a spokesperson. We categorically reject any suggestion of improper influence over government contracting processes. But as investigators dug deeper into the massive data trove, connections between Meridian and the Lake Michigan Circle became increasingly apparent. Financial records showed that shell companies linked to Franklin Westbrook had received millions in funding from subsidiaries 3 levels removed from Meridian's main operations. Digital communications, though carefully worded, demonstrated coordination between Meridian executives and regional operators like Westbrook. Most significantly, the documents revealed a sophisticated system for identifying and recruiting public officials with influence over contracting processes. Potential targets were assessed based on financial pressures, personal vulnerabilities, and psychological profiles. Those deemed receptive were approached with escalating offers, beginning with legitimate consulting opportunities or speaking engagements, then gradually progressing to more explicit arrangements. Vincent Doherty's name appeared in these records. A 2007 assessment described him as ambitious, pragmatic, with financial pressures exceeding his official compensation, and high potential for cultivation. Subsequent entries tracked his incorporation into the network, noting his exceptional talent for managing local assets and willingness to take necessary measures to protect operations. When federal agents presented this information to Doherty in prison, he initially refused to comment, but after reviewing the documentation and considering the potential benefits of cooperation, he eventually confirmed the basic structure Washington had uncovered. Westbrook never told me who was really pulling the strings, Doherty stated in a sealed deposition. That was how it worked. Each level only knew their immediate contacts above and below. But I always understood we were part of something bigger. The resources, the legal protection, the political connections, those came from somewhere well above our pay grade. The investigation accelerated through early 2024, with federal prosecutors building cases against Meridian executives and their associates. As the probe expanded, it reached into unexpected territories, including defense contracting, healthcare systems, and technology infrastructure projects. The most shocking development came in May 2024, when investigators discovered communication. Records suggesting that Robert Harrington's murder may have been directed from within Meridian itself, not merely suggested to Doherty by Westbrook as previously believed. Digital forensics experts recovered an encrypted message sent from a Meridian executive's account to Westbrook 2 days before the murder, stating, "The Michigan situation requires immediate containment. Total information control is essential. Your regional manager should understand the stakes and act accordingly. No further digital communication on this matter." This message suggested a level of culpability far beyond what had been established in the original case. If Meridian executives had effectively ordered Harrington's murder, they could potentially face federal conspiracy charges, but proving such a case would be extraordinarily difficult given the deliberately vague language and layers of intermediaries. 4. Sophia Reynolds, now retired from the police force, but working as a consultant with the federal task force, this revelation was both vindication and heartbreak. "I always sensed there were bigger players we weren't seeing," she told investigators, but knowing that Bobby's death was essentially a corporate decision, that's a different level of evil. In June 2024, the first major indictments against Meridian executives were unsealed. Edward Halsey and 4 other senior leaders faced charges including racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, money laundering, and tax evasion. The indictment described their operation as an unprecedented capture of public resources for private gain, executed through systematic corruption of the contract bidding process in targeted communities nationwide. The scale of the alleged corruption was staggering. Prosecutors estimated that the scheme had diverted over $7 billion in public funds through manipulated contracts over a 15-year period, affecting infrastructure projects, public safety, systems, healthcare services, and technology initiatives across the country. As the Meridian case progressed toward trial, its connections to the Pinewood Ridge tragedy became increasingly clear. Evidence suggested that Mayor Harrington had unknowingly stumbled onto a node of a national corruption network, his local investigation threatening a system that extended far beyond his small lakeside city. This revelation transformed the public understanding of what had happened in Pinewood Ridge. Robert Harrington was no longer simply a small city mayor who had crossed a corrupt police chief. He had become, albeit unwittingly, a threat to a sophisticated criminal enterprise with billions at stake. The case took another dramatic turn in September 2024 when Edward Halsey agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for consideration. In sentencing, his testimony implicated several even more prominent figures, including a former cabinet secretary, 2 senators, and several high-profile business leaders who had allegedly provided political protection and investment capital. For the corruption network, the genius of the system was its compartmentalization, explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Denise Rodriguez, who led the prosecution team. Most participants only understood their own small piece. Local officials like Doherty thought they were part of regional schemes. Regional operators like Westbrook believed they were at the top. Only a handful of people saw the complete picture. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, these revelations brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication in knowing that Robert Harrington's stand against corruption had ultimately led to the exposure of a national criminal enterprise. But there was also a renewed sense of violation. Their community's tragedy had been merely collateral damage in a much larger scheme. "We were just a dot on their map," said Mayor Samantha Keller during a community forum addressing the new developments. But what they didn't count on was that this dot would fight back. This community, through incredible pain and disillusionment, found its integrity, and ultimately, that integrity helped bring down something much bigger than we ever imagined. In Dice, October 2024, Sarah Matthews, now serving as Michigan's Attorney General, announced the formation of a special commission to examine how the corruption network had managed to operate undetected for so long and to recommend structural reforms to prevent similar schemes in the future. The most disturbing aspect of this case isn't just the money that was stolen from taxpayers, Matthews stated. It's how the system was designed to capture the very institutions meant to prevent such corruption. When those with money and power can effectively purchase the oversight mechanisms intended to constrain them, democracy itself is threatened. The Commission's preliminary report, released in early 2025, identified critical vulnerabilities in public contracting systems nationwide and recommended comprehensive reforms, including mandatory transparency databases for all public contracts, enhanced protections for whistleblowers, independent oversight committees with investigative authority, strict limitations on the revolving door between government and private contractors, advanced data analytics to identify suspicious patterns in contract awards. These recommendations, collectively known as the Harrington Standards, have begun to be implemented in Michigan and several other states, with federal legislation pending in Congress for the individuals most directly affected by the Pinewood Ridge tragedy. The expanding scope of the case has brought both closure and new purpose. Elaine Winters, whose financial scrutiny had first uncovered Dougherty's scheme, now leads a national organization training municipal finance officials to identify signs of corruption. Detective Reynolds has become a sought-after consultant and speaker on public integrity investigations. And in Pinewood Ridge itself, the city has established the Harrington Fellowship, a program that places ethics advocates in local governments across the state. What happened here was tragic, reflected Linda Patel, the former communications specialist who had helped preserve the evidence that eventually exposed the broader conspiracy. But Bobby always believed that the government could be a force for good when good people stood up for what's right. In a way, he's still doing that work. His example continues to inspire others to take a stand. The trial of Edward Halsey and his associates is scheduled to begin in late 2025, with prosecutors pursuing the maximum penalties available under federal law. The investigation continues to expand, with new indictments expected as the full extent of the corruption network is uncovered. For Vincent Dougherty, whose murder of Robert Harrington had unwittingly set in motion the unraveling of a national criminal enterprise, the legacy is one of infamy. His continued cooperation with federal authorities has provided valuable insights into the operation's methods, but can never erase his fundamental betrayal of public trust. In his most recent deposition, Dougherty offered what some saw as a moment of genuine reflection. I told myself it was just business. Everyone does it, just not everyone admits it. But when I looked into Bobby Harrington's eyes that night, I knew what I was doing was evil. I just couldn't stop myself. The system had consumed me long before I pulled that trigger. The story of Pinewood Ridge, a small city that became the unlikely epicenter of a national reckoning with corruption, continues to evolve. What began with one mayor's commitment to transparent governance and one police chief's deadly determination to preserve his illicit profits has expanded into a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle to protect public institutions from private exploitation. As Amelia Washington wrote in the conclusion to her groundbreaking series, the true measure of this story isn't found in the billions of dollars diverted or the prestigious names implicated. It's found in the courage of ordinary individuals who refuse to look away when confronted with wrongdoing, regardless of the personal cost. Their example reminds us that systems, no matter how corrupted, are ultimately composed of people making choices and can be redeemed by people making different ones. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge and communities across the country affected by similar schemes, that message offers both a sobering reminder of vulnerability and a powerful affirmation of resilience. The struggle between corruption and integrity continues, but now with the spotlight focused more brightly than ever on those who would betray the public trust. As the federal case against Meridian Capital Partners progressed through preliminary hearings in early 2025, investigators uncovered an aspect of the corruption network that had previously remained hidden, an elaborate system designed not just to facilitate corruption, but to aggressively suppress those who threatened to expose it. This containment protocol, as it was labeled in internal documents, went far beyond the murder of Robert Harrington. Evidence revealed a methodical approach to identifying, monitoring, and neutralizing potential whistleblowers across multiple jurisdictions, sometimes through legal intimidation, sometimes through character assassination, and in at least 7 cases, through arranged accidents or suicides. The key figure in this operation was Meridian's chief security officer, Gabriel Blackwood. A former intelligence operative with extensive experience in counter-terrorism, Blackwood had joined Meridian in 2008, ostensibly to protect the firm's executives and intellectual property. In reality, he had built what amounted to a private intelligence agency dedicated to preserving the corruption network. Blackwood ran what they called the Preservation Division, explained FBI analyst Teresa Navarro, who specialized in analyzing the Meridian documents. They maintained surveillance on hundreds of targets, journalists, auditors, law enforcement officials, even their own employees who showed signs of moral qualms. The discovery of this operation began with a seemingly unrelated development. In December 2024, a data security specialist named Aaron Mitchell was found dead in his Seattle apartment, reportedly from an accidental overdose of fentanyl-laced cocaine. Mitchell had no known history of drug use, and friends described him as meticulous and health-conscious. More significantly, investigators learned that Mitchell had recently been hired as a contractor by the Justice Department to help analyze the encrypted portions of the data dump that journalist Amelia Washington had received. His specialized expertise in recovering deleted and disguised digital information had made him particularly valuable to the investigation. The timing raised immediate red flags, said Special Agent Carlos Mendez, who led the FBI's investigation into Mitchell's death. He dies of an accidental overdose 3 days after accessing a particularly sensitive cache of Meridian files. That's not a coincidence. Forensic examination confirmed Mendez's suspicions. The cocaine found in Mitchell's apartment contained a lethal concentration of fentanyl, far higher than typically seen in street drugs. Security footage from his building had been tampered with, showing signs of professional digital manipulation. Most telling of all, Mitchell's laptop, which contained copies of some Meridian files, was missing. Though his apartment showed no signs of a conventional break-in, the investigation into Mitchell's death led authorities to identify 3 other recent deaths connected to the Meridian case, all individuals who had access to sensitive information and all ruled as accidents or suicides under circumstances that, in retrospect, appeared suspicious. These included Deanna Foster, a compliance officer at First Atlantic Bank, which had processed transactions for several Meridian shell companies. She had died in a single-car accident 2 weeks after being interviewed by federal investigators. Marcus Sullivan, the investigative journalist who had collaborated with Mayor Harrington. His 2018 heart attack was now being re-examined in light of evidence suggesting he may have been poisoned with a substance that mimics natural cardiac arrest. Thomas Reeves, a former Meridian executive who had indicated willingness to cooperate with authorities. He had allegedly committed suicide by jumping from his Manhattan apartment balcony, though the forensic review suggested he may have been unconscious when he fell. "We're looking at a systematic elimination of threats," Mendez explained during a secure briefing to the task force. "This isn't opportunistic, it's strategic. These people have been operating what amounts to a corporate assassination program for years." Armed with this disturbing hypothesis, federal agents executed a search warrant at Gabriel Blackwood's residences in New York and Virginia. The operation yielded encrypted hard drives that, once decoded, contained what amounted to a playbook for eliminating threats to the corruption network. The files included psychological profiles of potential targets, surveillance reports, and what were euphemistically called intervention scenarios for individuals deemed dangerous to Meridian's interests. These scenarios ranged from planting false evidence of professional misconduct to elaborately staged accidents designed to appear natural or self-inflicted. Most chilling was a document titled Threat Matrix 2015-2023, which listed 64 individuals who had been subjected to various forms of intervention. 11 of those individuals were now deceased, including Robert Harrington and the recently identified victims. The discovery prompted U.S. Attorney Olivia Gonzalez to expand the Meridian indictment to include charges of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. Gabriel Blackwood, who had initially been a peripheral figure in the corruption case, now became a primary target for federal prosecutors. "What we're seeing here goes beyond white-collar crime," Gonzalez stated in a closed-door briefing to Justice Department officials. "This is an organized criminal enterprise that viewed murder as just another risk management strategy. As federal agents moved to arrest Blackwood at his Virginia estate in February 2025, they discovered he had fled the country. Subsequent intelligence indicated he had traveled through a series of nations with limited extradition agreements with the United States, eventually disappearing in Eastern Europe. An international manhunt was launched, with Interpol issuing a red notice for Blackwood's arrest. But the former intelligence operative had extensive experience in evading detection and appeared to have prepared meticulously for the possibility of having to disappear. While the search for Blackwood continued, prosecutors focused on building their expanded case against Meridian's leadership. The new evidence suggested that while not all executives had direct knowledge of the Preservation Division's most extreme actions, several had authorized its formation and provided it with virtually unlimited resources and autonomy. The investigation also shed new light on the murder of Robert Harrington. Phone records and encrypted communications revealed that in the days before the murder, Gabriel Blackwood had traveled to Michigan, staying at a remote lake house 50 miles from Pinewood Ridge. During this period, he had multiple phone conversations with Franklin Westbrook, who in turn communicated with Vincent Doherty. "The chain of command is now clear," explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Rodriguez. Halsey authorized Blackwood to manage the Harrington situation. Blackwood coordinated with Westbrook, who pressured Doherty to eliminate the immediate threat. Each level maintained plausible deniability while ensuring the desired outcome. When presented with this evidence, Doherty confirmed the basics sequence, but claimed he had never met or spoken directly with anyone from Meridian. "Westbrook just told me the orders came from upstairs and that resources would be available if I needed help making it clean," he stated. "I didn't ask questions. In that world, knowing too much was dangerous." The revelation that Harrington's murder had been effectively authorized by corporate executives in a New York boardroom sent shockwaves through the nation's business and political establishments. It raised disturbing questions about the intersection of corporate power and violence, questions that extended far beyond the specific case. If one firm felt empowered to eliminate threats this way, how many others might be operating similar systems? Asked Senator Eleanor Hayes during congressional hearings on corporate corruption in March 2025. "We may be seeing just the tip of an iceberg of corporate violence against whistleblowers and investigators." The congressional investigation prompted hundreds of local and state agencies across the country to review suspicious deaths connected to corruption investigations over the previous decade. Several cold cases were reopened, and patterns began to emerge, suggesting that the Meridian approach might not have been unique. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, the expanding case brought a painful reframing of their community's tragedy. The murder that had once seemed a local crime of corruption had been revealed as something far more sinister, a calculated corporate hit authorized from thousands of miles away. It's almost worse, knowing Bobby was killed on orders from some executive who probably couldn't find Pinewood Ridge on a map, said former communications specialist Linda Patel. To them, he wasn't even a person, just a problem to be solved. This sentiment was echoed by many in the community who struggled to process how their small city had become collateral damage in a national scheme of corporate corruption. Local commemorations of Harrington took on new dimensions, celebrating not just his stand against local corruption, but his unwitting challenge to a system that affected communities nationwide. As the federal case expanded, some of the most revealing testimony came from lower-level Meridian employees who had been unaware of the company's criminal activities. Several described a corporate culture built on intimidation and compartmentalization, where questioning certain decisions or requesting additional information about specific projects was career suicide. There were entire floors at headquarters that regular employees couldn't access, recalled Jennifer Sandoval, a former Meridian financial analyst who became a key witness. Certain client names were never to be mentioned in emails or documents. We were told it was for client confidentiality. But now I understand it was to maintain deniability. Sandoval and others described a sophisticated system of internal surveillance that monitored employee communications for signs of potential whistleblowing. Those who asked too many questions found themselves marginalized, transferred to dead-end positions, or subjected to manufactured performance issues that led to termination. They created a climate of fear, Sandoval testified. Everyone understood there were boundaries you didn't cross if you wanted to keep your job, or worse, as we now know. By April 2025, the Meridian investigation had expanded to include several major financial institutions that had facilitated the company's operations. Prosecutors alleged that these banks had failed to fulfill their legal obligations to identify and report suspicious transactions, instead creating specialized services that helped obscure the movement of funds through the corruption network. 2. Senior executives at First Atlantic Bank were indicted for conspiracy and money laundering, with prosecutors claiming they had knowingly designed banking products specifically to help Meridian evade regulatory scrutiny. Internal emails showed the executives discussing the premium fees the bank could charge for these enhanced privacy services. The investigation also reached into the political realm, with evidence suggesting that Meridian had systematically cultivated relationships with elected officials across the political spectrum. These politicians had received campaign contributions, lucrative speaking engagements, and in some cases, hidden financial benefits in exchange for helping the company secure contracts or avoid regulatory scrutiny. Former Congressman William Steele, who had chaired a committee overseeing government contracting, was indicted for accepting bribes disguised as consulting fees after leaving office. Prosecutors alleged that while in Congress, Steele had helped direct federal contracts toward Meridian-affiliated companies and blocked legislation that would have increased transparency in the contracting process. The corruption metastasized through our political and financial systems, said U.S. Attorney Gonzalez during a press conference announcing the expanded indictments. Meridian understood that capturing the regulatory and oversight mechanisms was as important as capturing the contracts themselves. As the case expanded beyond Meridian to include its enablers and beneficiaries, it became what legal experts described as the most complex corruption prosecution in American history. The trial, scheduled to begin in September 2025, was expected to last at least 6 months and involve hundreds of witnesses. For Sophia Reynolds, the retired detective who had solved Mayor Harrington's murder, the expanding case brought both vindication and new purpose. She joined a Justice Department task force created to develop training programs for local law enforcement agencies in identifying and investigating corruption networks. Local officers are the front line against these schemes, Reynolds explained during a training session for police executives. But they've been playing checkers while the criminals are playing chess. We need to equip them to recognize the patterns and protect potential whistleblowers before more lives are lost. The task force's work took on added urgency in May 2025, when Gabriel Blackwood resurfaced in a video posted to encrypted messaging channels. Speaking from an undisclosed location, the former security chief denied any wrongdoing and claimed he was being scapegoated to protect more powerful interests. Meridian was just one node in a much larger network, Blackwood claimed. The real power players remain untouched. If I return to face these fabricated charges, I won't live long enough to see trial. While federal authorities dismissed the video as an attempt by Blackwood to create leverage for a potential plea deal, his claims resonated with the public increasingly. Concerned about the scope of corporate influence over government functions, in Pinewood Ridge, the continuing revelations had transformed the community's understanding of its own story. What had once seemed a tragic but isolated incident of local corruption had become a case study in how global financial powers could reach into small communities with deadly effect. The city established an annual ethics conference named for Robert Harrington, bringing together journalists, law enforcement officials, and government watchdogs to develop strategies for identifying and combating corruption. The inaugural conference in June 2025 focused specifically on protecting whistleblowers and investigating suspicious deaths connected to corruption cases. Bobby believed that local government was where democracy either thrives or dies. Sarah Matthews told attendees during her keynote address, "He couldn't have known that his stand against corruption in our small city would eventually expose a system that threatens communities nationwide. But that's how change often happens. One person refuses to look away, regardless of the risk." As the federal case proceeded toward trial, the ripple effects continued to spread. State legislatures across the country began passing Harrington laws establishing enhanced protections for municipal whistleblowers and creating independent oversight mechanisms for public contracting. The financial industry faced new regulatory scrutiny, with federal agencies imposing billions in fines on banks that had facilitated Meridian's operations. Congress debated legislation that would require greater transparency in government contracting and limit the ability of former officials to profit from their government connections. For Vincent Dougherty, watching these developments from prison, the expanding case brought a complex mixture of emotions. While his cooperation with federal prosecutors had secured him certain privileges, he remained the man who had pulled the trigger, the direct instrument of a corporate murder campaign that had claimed multiple lives. In what would be his final interview before his death from cancer in 2026, Dougherty offered what seemed to be genuine remorse. "I told myself I was just protecting my interests, but I was really just a tool, disposable muscle for people who would never get their own hands dirty." Bobby Harrington had more courage in his little finger than I've had in my entire life. He stood up to the machine, and it killed him. But in the end, he won. That's the part they never counted on. The legacy of the Pinewood Ridge case continues to evolve. Edward Halsey and other Meridian executives face potential life sentences if convicted on all charges. Gabriel Blackwood remains at large, the subject of one of the most intensive international manhunts in FBI history. The full extent of the corruption network and whether Blackwood's claims about untouched power players have merit remains to be determined. But perhaps the most meaningful impact has been on ordinary citizens and Local officials across the country newly awakened to both the danger of corruption and the power of individual courage in confronting it. As Amelia Washington, whose reporting had helped crack the case open, wrote, "Robert Harrington never set out to expose a national conspiracy. He simply refused to tolerate corruption in his own backyard. And in doing so, he pulled a thread that has unraveled a tapestry of corruption stretching from coast to coast. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, that legacy is both a burden and an inspiration, a reminder that the institutions of democracy require constant vigilance, and that even in the face of seemingly overwhelming power, the courage of individuals can ultimately prevail. The price may be high, but as Robert Harrington's example continues to demonstrate, the alternative, surrendering public institutions to private exploitation, is ultimately far costlier. The bronze plaque recently installed beside his memorial in Harrington Park bears the Latin phrase he often quoted in his speeches, "Fiat justitia ruat caelum," let justice be done, though the heavens fall. For the former mayor of a small lakeside city, justice came at the ultimate price, but its ripples continue to spread, challenging corrupt systems and inspiring new guardians of the public trust across the nation. As the Meridian Capital partners, trial approached in September 2025, a stunning development threatened to derail the entire prosecution. 3 key witnesses, including Michael Renner, Vincent Dougherty's former partner in the original Pinewood Ridge corruption scheme, received identical threatening packages at their protected locations. Each package contained detailed information about their supposed security arrangements and photographs of their family members taken in the previous 48 hours. The message was clear. Despite being in federal protection, they were not safe. All 3 witnesses immediately expressed reluctance to testify, fearing for their families' safety. This was a sophisticated intimidation operation, explained U.S. Marshal Devon Clark, who oversaw witness security for the case. The fact that they penetrated our protection protocols suggested either remarkable surveillance capabilities or, more concerning, a leak within federal law enforcement. The FBI launched an urgent internal investigation, placing several agents and support staff on administrative leave while examining how the witnesses' locations could have been compromised. Meanwhile, prosecutors scrambled to reassure their witnesses and strengthen security protocols. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Amelia Washington, the investigative journalist whose reporting had helped expose Meridian's national network, received an encrypted message from a source claiming to have information about the witness intimidation campaign. After verifying the source's credibility, Washington arranged a secure meeting at a remote location outside Washington, D.C. The source turned out to be Natalie Spencer, former executive assistant to Gabriel Blackwood at Meridian's Preservation Division. Spencer had quietly gathered evidence about her boss's operations for nearly 2 years before the federal investigation began, storing encrypted files in multiple secure locations. "I started documenting everything when I realized what was really happening," Spencer told Washington. "At first, I thought I was working for corporate security, protecting trade secrets, monitoring competitors. Then I saw the surveillance reports on journalists, prosecutors, even judges. I knew this wasn't normal corporate security." Spencer revealed that before fleeing the country, Blackwood had established a contingency team, former military and intelligence contractors operating independently from Meridian, but funded through untraceable cryptocurrency payments. This team was tasked with disrupting the federal prosecution through witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and, if necessary, eliminating key witnesses. More critically, Spencer provided documentation showing that the team had recruited an FBI analyst who had been providing them with classified information about witness locations and security protocols. The analyst, Timothy Drake, had received over $3 million through various offshore accounts in exchange for his cooperation. Washington immediately shared this information with federal authorities, leading to Drake's arrest in July 2025. Under intense questioning and faced with overwhelming evidence, Drake confessed to working for Blackwood's network and identified several other corrupt officials within federal agencies who had been compromised through bribes or blackmail. This revelation led to a major housecleaning within federal law enforcement, with a dozen officials removed from their positions and facing criminal charges. More importantly, it allowed prosecutors to secure their witness protection program and proceed with the case against Meridian's leadership. The trial finally began on October 15, 2025, in the federal courthouse in New York. Security was unprecedented, with the building essentially transformed into a fortress. Edward Halsey and 5 other Meridian executives faced dozens of charges, including racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and bribery. The prosecution's case was built on 3 main pillars: the financial evidence showing how Meridian had manipulated public contracts, testimony from former employees and associates about the company's operations, and the documentation of the Preservation Division's efforts to eliminate threats through violence and intimidation. This is not simply a case about financial crimes. Lead prosecutor Olivia Gonzalez told the jury in her opening statement, "This is about a criminal enterprise that wielded money and murder with equal facility to capture public resources across this nation. When bribes and threats failed, they turned to assassination, calculating that killing a small-town mayor or a troublesome journalist was simply a cost of doing business." The defense team, led by renowned attorney James Montgomery, attempted to distance the Meridian executives from the most serious charges. They acknowledged certain financial improprieties, but insisted that any violent actions had been taken by rogue employees operating without authorization from company leadership. The prosecution wants you to believe that respected business leaders casually ordered murders over lunch meetings, Montgomery argued. The evidence will show that Gabriel Blackwood, a man with a shadowy past in intelligence operations, created his own private fiefdom within Meridian and conducted these heinous acts without the knowledge or approval of his superiors. This defense strategy collapsed during the 3rd week of the trial, when prosecutors introduced a series of encrypted recordings made by Natalie Spencer. In one, Edward Halsey could be clearly heard discussing with Blackwood the need to permanently resolve the Michigan situation, followed by explicit authorization to use all necessary resources to protect the company's interests. In another recording, Halsey and other executives reviewed what they called containment actions taken against potential whistleblowers, including the deaths that had previously been classified as accidents or suicides. The casual tone with which they discussed these deaths, at one point referring to them as necessary business expenses, visibly shocked several jurors. The most damning evidence concerned Robert Harrington's murder. A recorded conversation from January 2018 captured Halsey explicitly authorizing Blackwood to eliminate the Pinewood Ridge problem after being informed that the mayor was preparing to contact state authorities. "Make sure it's clean," Halsey could be heard saying. "We can't afford another Minneapolis situation." The reference to Minneapolis remained unexplained, but investigators believed it referred to a previous operation that had apparently gone wrong. Facing this overwhelming evidence, 2 of the defendants, Meridian's CFO Lawrence Patterson and Operations Director Helen Winters, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Their testimony further implicated Halsey and exposed the full scope of Meridian's operations. Winters, who had overseen much of Meridian's contract manipulation system, provided particularly valuable testimony about the political connections that had facilitated the scheme. She identified dozens of elected officials who had received payments, campaign contributions, or other benefits in exchange for helping direct contracts to Meridian-affiliated companies. It was systematic, Winters testified. We had a formula for each jurisdiction, identify the key decision-makers, determine their price, and build relationships that ensured our companies would receive preferential treatment. Most officials never knew they were dealing with Meridian. They thought they were working with independent local businesses. As the trial progressed, its impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Congressional hearings examined the broader issue of corporate influence over public contracting. Investigative journalists in cities across the country began identifying local contract patterns that matched Meridian's methods, suggesting the potential existence of similar operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched investigations into several private equity firms with business models similar to Meridian's, focusing on their investments in companies that secured government contracts. The Defense Department and General Services Administration initiated comprehensive reviews of their contracting procedures to identify and close vulnerabilities. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, the trial brought a complex mixture of emotions. Many followed the proceedings closely, gathering at community centers and restaurants to watch key testimony. The revelations about how Harrington's murder had been authorized in a corporate boardroom reinforced both the tragedy of his death and the significance of his stand against corruption. It's like watching the finale of a story where we were just the opening chapter, reflected Sarah Matthews, now Michigan's Attorney General, during a community forum. Bobby could never have imagined that his fight against local corruption would eventually expose something of this magnitude. But that's often how justice works. It starts with someone willing to stand firm on principle, regardless of the consequences. In Pinewood Ridge itself, the city continued its transformation under Mayor Samantha Keller's leadership. The reforms implemented after Dougherty's conviction had been strengthened following the Meridian revelations. The city now required unprecedented levels of transparency in all contracting processes, with detailed information about bidding, selection criteria, and contract terms publicly accessible through an online portal. The Harrington Memorial Ethics Center, established in the former mayor's honor, had expanded its mission to include training for municipal officials from across the Midwest. Its annual conference drew participants from hundreds of communities seeking to implement similar reforms and protect themselves from corruption. "We've turned our tragedy into a mission," Mayor Keller explained to visitors. "No community should have to lose a leader to violence before recognizing the importance of ethical governance." As the trial entered its second month, the prosecution turned to its final and perhaps most powerful witness, Sophia Reynolds, the detective who had solved Harrington's murder and later helped unravel the broader conspiracy. Now serving as a special advisor to the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, Reynolds provided compelling testimony connecting the local corruption in Pinewood Ridge to Meridian's national operation. Reynolds walked the jury through the investigation, from the initial crime scene in Harrington's office to the gradual discovery of Dougherty's corruption network, and ultimately to the evidence linking that local scheme to Meridian's broader operations. She described how Meridian had essentially franchised corruption, creating similar structures in communities across the country while maintaining plausible deniability through layers of intermediaries. "They created a perfect system," Reynolds testified. "Local officials like Chief Dougherty believed they were the masterminds of their own schemes. Regional operators like Franklin Westbrook thought they were the top of the pyramid. Only a handful of people at Meridian understood the complete structure and how all the pieces fit together." During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to portray Reynolds as an ambitious investigator seeking publicity through an expansive conspiracy theory. This strategy backfired dramatically when Reynolds calmly presented additional evidence. She had personally gathered connecting Meridian executives directly to operations in multiple cities. "I've spent the last 3 years tracking these connections," she explained. "Every community had its Vincent Dougherty, a local official willing to betray public trust for personal gain. But behind each of them was the same corporate structure, the same methods, and ultimately the same beneficiaries." As the prosecution prepared to rest its case in December 2025, a dramatic development occurred. Gabriel Blackwood, still a fugitive and reportedly in Eastern Europe, released a comprehensive digital dossier to selected media outlets worldwide. The materials included internal Meridian documents, recorded conversations, and financial records, far more extensive than what prosecutors had presented. Most explosively, the documents implicated several individuals who had not been charged, including 2 former cabinet secretaries, several prominent business leaders, and a Supreme Court justice who had previously worked for a law firm representing Meridian. The materials suggested these individuals had either actively participated in the corruption scheme or helped protect it from investigation. Blackwood accompanied the document dump with a video statement explaining his actions. "I am not releasing this information out of nobility," he stated. "I have committed unconscionable acts in service to power. But I refuse to be the only sacrifice on the altar of public outrage, while those who gave the orders and reaped the greatest benefits remain untouched." Federal authorities scrambled to verify the authenticity of Blackwood's documents while dealing with the public fallout. Several of the implicated individuals immediately issued denials, while others resigned from their positions pending investigation. The Supreme Court justice announced a temporary recusal from all cases while the allegations were examined. The document release complicated the ongoing trial, with defense attorneys moving for a mistrial based on the new information. Judge Eleanor Washington denied the motion, but granted a 2-week recess to allow both prosecution and defense teams to review the materials and adjust their strategies accordingly. When the trial resumed in January 2026, prosecutors incorporated selected portions of Blackwood's documents into their case, focusing particularly on communications that further implicated the defendants already on trial. They also announced that investigations into the newly implicated individuals were ongoing, with additional indictments possible in the coming months. After 12 weeks of testimony and over 200 witnesses, the case finally went to the jury in February 2026. After deliberating for 9 days, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all major counts for Edward Halsey and 3 other executives. The remaining 2 defendants were convicted on financial charges, but acquitted on the most serious counts related to murder and witness tampering. At the sentencing hearing in April 2026, Judge Washington delivered a scathing assessment of the defendants' actions before imposing her judgment. "You have committed crimes not just against individuals, but against the very foundation of democratic governance," she told them. "You treated public institutions as commodities to be purchased and exploited. When faced with exposure, you responded, not with contrition, but with calculated violence. Edward Halsey received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole for his role in ordering the murders of Robert Harrington and others who had threatened the conspiracy. The other executives received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in the violent aspects of the scheme." The aftermath of the trial saw significant legal and regulatory reforms at both state and federal levels. Congress passed the Public Contracting Integrity Act, establishing new transparency requirements and independent oversight mechanisms for government contracts. Multiple states implemented Harrington protocols, requiring rigorous conflict of interest disclosures from all officials involved in contract decisions. The financial industry faced new regulations specifically designed to prevent the money laundering. and financial manipulation that had facilitated Meridian's operations. Several major banks entered into deferred prosecution agreements, paying billions in fines and agreeing to external monitoring of their compliance systems. Gabriel Blackwood remained at large, though Interpol reported occasional sightings across Eastern Europe and Asia. His document dump continued to reverberate through the legal and political systems, with ongoing investigations into the additional individuals he had implicated. 3 former officials had been indicted based on the evidence he provided, with more cases under development. For Pinewood Ridge, the conclusion of the Meridian trial represented both an ending and a beginning. The community had been forever changed by the events that began with Robert Harrington's murder, but it had emerged with a renewed commitment to transparent and ethical governance. The city established an annual Harrington Day dedicated to civic, education, and community service. The waterfront development that the murdered mayor had championed became a thriving center of community life, with a bronze statue of Harrington overlooking the park that bore his name. Perhaps most significantly, Pinewood Ridge became a model for communities seeking to protect themselves from corruption. Officials from across the country visited to study the city's transparency systems and ethics training programs. The reforms born from tragedy had created a legacy that extended far beyond the city's borders. Bobby used to say that democracy happens at street level, Linda Patel recalled during the 5th anniversary commemoration of Harrington's death. He believed that if we couldn't maintain integrity in our local institutions, we couldn't expect it in Washington or Wall Street. He died defending that principle. But in death, he achieved what perhaps he never could have in life, a nationwide awakening to the fragility of public trust and the constant vigilance required to preserve it. The story of Pinewood Ridge, from a police chief's betrayal to a national reckoning with corporate corruption, had become more than a true crime narrative. It had evolved into a case study in both the vulnerability of democratic institutions and their resilience when defended by individuals of principle and courage. As one editorial observed following the Meridian verdicts, Robert Harrington's name may never appear in history textbooks alongside great reformers and civic leaders, but his stand against corruption in a small Michigan city ultimately exposed and brought down a criminal enterprise that had captured public institutions across the nation. In an age of cynicism about government, his example reminds us that integrity still matters and that sometimes it matters enough to die for. 2 years after the Meridian trial concluded in the spring of 2028, the elusive Gabriel Blackwood was finally located in a small coastal town in Montenegro. The former security chief, who had orchestrated numerous killings to protect Meridian's criminal enterprise, was found dead in his rented villa, an apparent suicide with a handwritten confession beside him. The 12-page document detailed operations not previously revealed, including 3 additional murders connected to the corruption network. It also named several powerful figures who had allegedly helped protect Meridian's operations but had escaped prosecution. Most significantly, it contained account numbers and access codes for digital vaults, holding terabytes of additional evidence Blackwood had maintained as his insurance policy. FBI agents working with Interpol secured the villa and began analyzing the confession and digital evidence. Initial verification suggested the materials were authentic, though some questioned whether Blackwood's death was truly self-inflicted given the mysterious circumstances and the many enemies he had accumulated. The timing is suspicious, noted Special Agent Laura Diaz, who had been tracking Blackwood for years. He maintained his freedom for this long through extreme caution and multiple layers of security. For him to suddenly be found this way raises questions. Forensic examination eventually determined that Blackwood had indeed taken his own life, but only after being diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. Medical records found in the villa indicated he had received his diagnosis 3 months earlier and had been given less than 6 months to live. He chose the time and manner of his departure, explained Dr. Marcus Chen, the FBI's lead forensic psychologist assigned to analyze the case. The confession appears to be his final act, not from remorse, but from a desire to control the narrative even in death and perhaps settle some final scores. The evidence Blackwood left behind triggered a new wave of investigations and prosecutions. A special Justice Department task force was established to methodically work through the materials, which implicated dozens of additional figures in business, politics, and law enforcement. By late 2028, the Blackwood Files, as they became known, had led to indictments against 14 previously untouched individuals, including a former director of the FBI's criminal division who had allegedly helped shield Meridian from investigation in exchange for post-retirement consulting contracts worth millions. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, these continuing revelations reinforced both the significance of their community's tragedy and its ongoing impact on national affairs. The small city, once known primarily for its lakefront charm, had become permanently associated with one of the most consequential corruption cases in American history. "Sometimes I wonder what Bobby would make of all this," Sarah Matthews reflected during an interview marking the 10th anniversary of Robert Harrington's murder. "He was fighting for a transparent government in our hometown, not trying to bring down a national conspiracy. But that's how integrity works. You stand for what's right in your own sphere, and sometimes that ripples outward in ways you could never imagine." The Harrington Memorial Ethics Center continued to expand its mission, becoming a nationally recognized institution for training in governmental ethics and corruption prevention. Its annual conference drew participants from across the country and beyond, with case studies from the Meridian affair forming a core part of the curriculum. Vincent Doherty, who had died in prison in 2026, remained a complex figure in the narrative. The local enforcer whose actions had ultimately helped expose the larger criminal enterprise. His cooperation with federal authorities had provided crucial evidence, yet he remained the man who had murdered an elected official to protect a corrupt system. In one of his final interviews before his death, Doherty had offered what seemed to be genuine reflection. "I've had years to think about what I did and why. The system didn't make me pull that trigger. I made that choice. But the system created the conditions where someone like me could flourish. It rewarded the worst parts of human nature and punished the best. That doesn't excuse anything, but it helps explain how we got here." Edward Halsey continued serving his life sentence at the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, maintaining his silence aside from unsuccessful appeals. The other convicted Meridian executives had been scattered across the federal prison system, their attempts to have their sentences reduced repeatedly denied. The most enduring legacy of the case emerged in the form of institutional reforms. The Harrington Act, passed by Congress in 2027, established the Federal Contract Integrity Commission, an independent agency with broad authority to investigate potential corruption in government contracting at all levels. The legislation also created enhanced whistleblower protections and mandatory transparency requirements for all public contracts exceeding certain thresholds. Similar laws were enacted in 43 states, creating what policy experts called the most significant anti-corruption framework since the post-Watergate reforms. These measures had already identified and prevented numerous contract manipulation schemes, saving taxpayers billions while restoring some measure of public trust in government institutions. For Detective Sophia Reynolds, whose investigation of A single murder had eventually exposed a national criminal enterprise. The case defined both her career and her life's mission. After retiring from government service in 2027, she established a non-profit organization dedicated to training local law enforcement in identifying and investigating corruption. Local detectives and prosecutors are the first line of defense, Reynolds explained during a training session for police investigators. By the time federal authorities get involved, the corruption has usually been entrenched for years. We need to equip local officers to recognize the warning signs early and act before the damage becomes catastrophic. The final chapter of the Pinewood Ridge story came in 2029, when a comprehensive academic study examined the full impact of the case on American governance, law enforcement, and corporate regulation. The study, conducted by researchers from multiple universities, concluded that the case had fundamentally altered how Americans viewed the intersection of corporate power and public institutions. Before the Meridian case, corporate corruption was typically understood in purely financial terms, the researchers wrote. What the Harrington murder and subsequent investigations revealed was something more sinister: the willingness of seemingly legitimate business leaders to employ violence as a tool of corporate strategy when billions in illicit profits were at stake. This recognition had prompted new approaches to corporate accountability, with prosecutors increasingly willing to pursue criminal charges against executives rather than settling for financial penalties against their companies. Several states had modified their laws to make it easier to hold corporate leaders personally responsible for crimes committed in their organization's interest. For ordinary citizens, perhaps the most significant outcome was a renewed sense of agency in confronting corruption. The example of Robert Harrington, a small city mayor who had taken a stand based on principle despite the personal risk, had inspired others to come forward with evidence of wrongdoing in their own communities. We've seen a marked increase in whistleblower reports since the Meridian case concluded, noted Eleanor Reynolds, director of the Public Integrity Division at the Justice Department, and no relation to Sophia Reynolds. People who might previously have remained silent are finding the courage to speak up. They've seen that a single person of integrity can ultimately bring down even the most powerful, corrupt system. In Pinewood Ridge itself, the tragedy had become woven into the community's identity, not as a defining limitation, but as a catalyst for transformation. The city's transparent governance systems had become a model studied by municipal officials nationwide. Its ethics training programs drew participants from across the country. The waterfront development that Mayor Harrington had championed had blossomed into a vibrant district that honored his vision while serving the community's needs. "We refuse to be defined solely by tragedy," Mayor Keller explained during the dedication of a new civic center in 2030. "Instead, we chose to be defined by our response to it, by building systems that make corruption difficult and accountability inevitable." The story of Pinewood Ridge, from murder to national reckoning, reminds us that while systems of power may seem impervious to change, they remain vulnerable to the courage of individuals willing to stand for principle, regardless of personal cost. Robert Harrington could never have imagined the consequences of his integrity, but those consequences continue to reshape American institutions, 10 years after his death, and surely for decades to come. 15 years after Mayor Robert Harrington's murder in January 2033, the case that many believed had reached its conclusion with the Meridian convictions and Gabriel Blackwood's suicide took an unexpected turn. A series of encrypted files from Blackwood's digital archive, programmed to unlock on the 15th anniversary of Harrington's death, were automatically released to several journalists and federal investigators who had worked on the case. These files, which Blackwood had labeled legacy insurance, contained evidence suggesting that Meridian Capital Partners had itself been merely one component of a more extensive corruption apparatus, one that continued to operate despite the prosecutions that had followed the Pinewood Ridge case. Blackwood set up a dead man's switch, explained cybersecurity expert Dr. Eliza Thornton, who helped analyze the encrypted files. He ensured these records would become public regardless of what happened to him. It was his final move in a very long game, revenge against those he believed had abandoned him while protecting themselves. The files detailed a network Blackwood called the Consortium, an alliance of private equity firms, banking interests, and influential political figures, who had allegedly coordinated to capture public contracting across multiple sectors of the economy. According to Blackwood's documentation, Meridian had been just one of 7 major firms operating similar corruption schemes, each focused on different regions and sectors, but sharing intelligence, methodologies, and political protection. Most disturbingly, the files suggested that while Meridian's operations had been exposed and dismantled, the other components of the consortium had simply adapted their methods and continued their activities with greater caution. Blackwood had meticulously tracked these operations during his years as a fugitive, compiling evidence through his extensive network of contacts in the corporate security world. "It's like cutting off one head of the Hydra," said Special Agent Marcus Reeves, who came out of retirement to help analyze the files. "We thought we'd eliminated the threat, but according to Blackwood, we just forced it to evolve." The Justice Department established a special task force to evaluate Blackwood's claims, initially approaching them with skepticism. Gabriel Blackwood had been a manipulative figure with potential motives to spread misinformation even from beyond the grave. Yet as investigators worked through the extensive documentation, they found disturbing patterns that aligned with Blackwood's allegations. The task force identified suspicious contracting patterns in multiple states that had not been connected to Meridian but bore striking similarities to its methods. They discovered financial transactions flowing through the same types of shell company structures that had facilitated Meridian's operations. Most concerning, they found evidence suggesting that several major corruption investigations in other jurisdictions had been mysteriously derailed or narrowed in scope when they began approaching certain well-connected entities. In April 2033, Attorney General Melissa Chen held a press conference announcing the formation of a National Public Integrity Commission with extraordinary powers to investigate these allegations. The corruption exposed through the Pinewood Ridge case was not an isolated criminal enterprise, but potentially part of a more pervasive threat to our democratic institutions, Chen stated. If these new allegations have merit, they represent a challenge to the rule of law that requires an unprecedented response. The Commission received special congressional authorization for expanded investigative powers and dedicated funding for a 5-year mandate. Its leadership included veterans of the Meridian prosecution, academic experts on corruption, and former local officials who had battled similar schemes in their communities. For Sophia Reynolds, now in her 60s and serving as special advisor to the Commission, the new investigation represented both vindication and challenge. "I always sensed there were wider connections we weren't seeing," she explained during a closed briefing, "but the scale Blackwood describes exceeds even my most cynical expectations." Reynolds was joined in the investigation by Sarah Matthews, who had served as Michigan's Attorney General before being appointed as a federal judge, and Amelia Washington, whose investigative journalism had been crucial in exposing Meridian's operations. Together, they formed the Commission's Critical Review Panel, tasked with ensuring that the investigation remained focused on evidence rather than conspiracy theories. The Commission's work faced immediate obstacles. Several prominent figures, implicated in Blackwood's files, mobilized legal challenges to the Commission's authority. Media organizations connected to alleged consortium members published stories questioning the reliability of evidence from a confessed criminal. Congressional allies of implicated individuals attempted to restrict the Commission's funding. Despite these challenges, the investigation proceeded methodically, focusing initially on the contracting patterns in three sectors: defense procurement, healthcare infrastructure, and telecommunications. Analyzing thousands of contracts awarded over the previous decade, investigators identified statistical anomalies that suggested potential manipulation of the bidding process. In a truly competitive environment, contract awards should show significant variation in winners, explained Dr. Jasmine Clark, the Commission's chief data scientist. What we found instead were patterns where certain companies consistently won contracts, despite submitting bids that weren't objectively superior. The statistical probability of these outcomes occurring naturally is essentially zero. The breakthrough came in August 2033, when Commission investigators executed search warrants at the offices of Callister Partners, a private equity firm specializing in healthcare investments. Hidden behind sophisticated encryption, they discovered internal communications discussing what executives called contract acquisition strategies, with language remarkably similar to that used by Meridian officials. More damning were references to the Michigan situation and avoiding another Pinewood scenario in discussions about managing potential whistleblowers. These documents suggested that Callister's leadership had not only been aware of Meridian's operations, but had learned from its downfall, implementing more sophisticated methods to achieve the same corrupt ends while minimizing exposure. As the Commission's investigation expanded, it uncovered connections between Callister and several other firms identified in Blackwood's files. These companies had superficially different ownership structures, but showed patterns of coordination in their investment strategies and political relationships. Together, they had effectively captured contracting in critical sectors worth hundreds of billions in public funds. They operated as competitors in public, but collaborators behind the scenes, explained Commission Chair Madison Reynolds during congressional testimony. This allowed them to create the appearance of a competitive marketplace while actually allocating contracts among themselves according to predetermined arrangements. The Commission's findings prompted a wave of new indictments beginning in early 2034. 27 executives from 5 major investment firms faced charges ranging from fraud and bribery to racketeering. 16 public officials, including 2 sitting governors and a federal judge, were implicated in facilitating the corrupt schemes. For the residents of Pinewood Ridge, these developments brought renewed attention to their community's pivotal role in exposing corruption. 15 years after Robert Harrington's murder, his stand against local corruption had led to the unraveling of not one, but 2 layers of a national criminal enterprise. Bobby would be amazed to see how far this has gone, reflected Linda Patel during a memorial service marking the anniversary of Harrington's death. He was just trying to protect our small city's budget from being plundered. He could never have imagined he was tugging on a thread that would eventually unravel corruption at this scale. The Harrington Memorial Ethics Center expanded its facilities to accommodate researchers studying the new evidence and developing enhanced training programs for public officials. The center established a dedicated consortium investigation archive to document how the corruption had evolved in response to earlier prosecutions and how it had ultimately been exposed. The most important lesson from both the Meridian case and these new revelations is that corruption adapts, explained Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the center's academic director. It learns from its failures and evolves new protective mechanisms. Our defense against it must evolve as well. This insight prompted significant reforms in how corruption investigations were conducted. Rather than treating each case as an isolated incident, authorities began implementing what they called network analysis, examining potential connections between seemingly unrelated corruption schemes and looking for common methodologies, financial structures, or beneficiaries. The Public Integrity Commission developed new software tools designed to identify suspicious patterns in government contracting across jurisdictions. These tools, made available to state and local authorities, helped identify potential corruption before it became entrenched. We can't rely solely on courageous individuals like Mayor Harrington to stand against corruption at great personal risk, explained Commission Technology Director Maya Patel. We need systems that can detect and disrupt corrupt networks before they capture institutions and resources. As the new prosecutions proceeded through the courts in 2034-35, they revealed the extent to which the consortium had learned from Meridian's mistakes. Their operations featured greater compartmentalization, more sophisticated money laundering techniques, and careful avoidance of explicit communications about illegal activities. Most significantly, the consortium had developed what prosecutors called a compromise and control system for managing potential whistleblowers. Rather than resorting to violence, which had ultimately led to Meridian's exposure, they had created elaborate mechanisms for collecting compromising information on those who might threaten their operations. This material could then be deployed to discredit or silence potential whistleblowers before they went public. They moved from eliminating threats to neutralizing them through other means, explained U.S. Attorney Gregory Washington during a press briefing. It was more sophisticated and less risky than Meridian's approach, but the fundamental goal remained the same: protecting their illegal operations by any means necessary. The trials of consortium members began in September 2035, attracting national attention. The proceedings revealed how the corruption had evolved in response to the Meridian prosecutions, with defendants having studied that case closely to identify and address vulnerabilities in their own operations. They treated the Meridian case as a learning opportunity, one prosecutor explained during opening arguments. They analyzed every step of how that conspiracy was exposed and built countermeasures into their own operations. What they failed to understand was that no system of corruption, no matter how sophisticated, can remain hidden indefinitely when enough people are committed to exposing it. The convictions of 15 consortium principals in March 2036 represented another milestone in the ongoing battle against systemic corruption. The sentences, ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment, reflected both the scale of their crimes and the court's recognition of the threat such operations posed to democratic governance. For the town of Pinewood Ridge, now nearly 2 decades removed from the murder that had first exposed this web of corruption, the legacy of Robert Harrington had evolved from tragic to transformative. The small city had become synonymous with citizen resistance to corruption, hosting international conferences on public integrity and training programs for officials from around the world. We've turned our deepest tragedy into a mission, Mayor Carlos Ramirez explained during the 20th anniversary commemoration of Harrington's death. This community refused to be defined by victimhood. Instead, we've become a symbol of resilience and a center for developing the tools and strategies needed to protect public institutions from corruption. The Harrington Memorial Park expanded to include an interactive learning center where visitors could explore the complex story that had unfolded from a single murder in a small-town mayor's office. The center didn't merely recount history, but actively engaged citizens in understanding how corruption operates and how ordinary individuals can recognize and resist it. The most powerful weapon against corruption isn't stronger laws or better enforcement, though both are essential, Sarah Matthews told visitors during the center's dedication. It's informed citizens who understand that public institutions belong to them, not to those who would exploit them for private gain. 20 years after a police chief murdered a mayor to protect a local corruption scheme, the ripple effects of that crime continued to transform how Americans understood and confronted the subversion of public institutions. The story that began in Pinewood Ridge had revealed layer after layer of corruption, each more sophisticated than the last, but had also demonstrated the ultimate power of principled resistance. As Sophia Reynolds reflected during her final public appearance before retiring from public life entirely, Vincent Doherty thought he was ending a threat when he pulled that trigger 20 years ago. Instead, he initiated a process that has exposed corruption at scales we could hardly imagine. Robert Harrington died that night, but his legacy continues to grow as each new layer of this corruption is exposed and dismantled. That's the true measure of his impact, not just what he accomplished in life, but what his example continues to inspire long after his death. The story of Pinewood Ridge would continue to evolve as investigations into the consortium's operations unveiled further connections and new prosecutions addressed previously hidden aspects of the corruption. But the fundamental narrative remained constant. One person's stand for integrity, whatever the personal cost, can ultimately challenge even the most entrenched systems of corruption. Robert Harrington's legacy isn't found merely in the prosecutions and reforms that followed his murder, but in the ongoing commitment to transparent governance that his example continues to inspire. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.